My friends. Hope you're doing well on this Sunday night. Um, I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place. I've been like, I'm gonna end up doing this probably in three parts. This is a pretty epic presentation, though, to be honest. Like, not most of the presentations in this or the next term will be like this intensive. And if you think, well, why? And it's like, well, part of the reason why is because it's such a, I stopped myself there from saying wild because I'm trying not to say the words wild and crazy and insane and intense as much, because those are words that, growing up in the '90s, anyone that grew up in the '80s and '90s uses those words for like everything. I'm trying to be more descriptive. It's like the intense, the just go right back to it. The beauty and the magnificence of early brain development can't be overstated. It's complete magic. And I'm only saying magic because I can't think of a stronger word. You go from a single cell to, the most complicated organ that we know of. All right, so basically, I think with this longer presentation, to just keep fresh and to keep, these videos a bit more bite-sized, and, that last one was about, I think, half an hour, 30, 40 minutes. This one will probably be about half an hour, and then I'll have another one that'll be about half an hour, and then I'll prepare you for the test and stuff. Um, and this is where I guess I ask for a little bit of grace, because, like, by the book, I should have this, like, out to you, and I'm supposed to have the quest thing to you, and I will have that probably tomorrow. And it's all there, and it's all, to be honest, I'm, like, kind of in that position of, like, do I rush it to you at a level I'm not happy with, or do I ask for your grace and get it to you kind of midweek, or not midweek, but, like, in the next day or so, and life's an interesting thing. Anyways, basically what I'm saying is, if you're just cool with me and understand that I'm just a human being, I think I told you my wife broke her foot. Just like the kids have been a bit hectic lately. I haven't been sleeping the greatest, blah 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 blah. But let me earn back the pace. And what I mean by that is, you know, I'm sometimes not the most organized person in the world, but I, I, I can lean on my work ethic, and I feel like most of you already understand. And to be honest, if after me trying to say that, if you still don't, I don't know what else I'll say. So let's just get into the presentation, and those with ears will hear. I think like one thing too is sometimes it's helpful to learn about this stuff from somebody that's not super impressed with themselves about how much they can talk sciencey, because it's like there's a easy tendency to get trapped in, oh, I've memorized the names of all this stuff so I get it. And it's like, well, I'm more worried if you like sort of conceptually follow, right? Like you can memorize that terminal buttons is something that releases a chemical, but like why does that matter? Well, why is like the word terminal sort of like what we would say a bus terminal that like sends someone from somewhere to somewhere else? It's like when we talk about actually how the brain works, we realize that it signals in sort of two ways. It neurally transmits messages across neurons, across cells that process information in the brain, either electrically or chemically, right? But when we're talking about these more complex chemical reactions, it's like there's a place that like literally releases certain chemicals. And the term for this is the terminal button, right? Which you see highlighted there is like D or whatever. That's just like a picture from the book. Right? So now think about this for a sec. I want you to think about this as if it's a chord, right? There's a chord that's going from, it's going to be weird whenever I try to do this because I'm like looking at myself doing it and it's the opposite of what I'm thinking I'm doing because it's mirrored and blah, blah, blah. But say you have a chord that's here and you're trying to send the signal across to it, right? An electrical synapses, they'd actually be not necessarily even touching, but the signal would like sort of jump, and it basically is, because even with electricity, it's not like electricity goes from the power plant and travels to your house like water does. It charges the thing beside it, right? And it's like that's the same in the brain. In the brain, you've maybe heard that in your classes, called action potential, which is just a fancy way of saying that there's like the potential for it to have energy, and that's at a certain point. Energy is, if you go one step before what energy is, it's the ability to be energy. Action potential, sort of like it's, again, you can get so lost in the, well, that's not exactly what the textbook says action potential is. It's the potential that, it's the potential to do action. It's potential action. It's energy that could be a thing. So it's almost like, I don't want to say like the energy version of stem cell, but it's like it's something that could go different directions. And that's why the word potential is like the second part of the word. And so anyways, it's like almost more important to conceptually get this idea that what we're really talking about is, if we're just passing electricity from here to here, right? You throw me a ball and I go like this quick and catch it. It's like that eye hand is mainly electric, but like if you say, Mike, that was interesting, but like, could your head be balder? And I'm like, oh, that hurts. It's like, well, what just hurt there? It's like that was some kind of complicated chemical reaction that happened, right? All I'm saying is that the ability, because you got to think that what a chemical does is, instead of it just being charged to charge, chemical says I might release 6 different things, different types of neurotransmitters, could, right? And then what that does, and it could release different amounts. So it lets the response be more nuanced and have more variety in it. I'm trying to explain the difference between like an electrical signal and a chemical signal, and the difference is really that a chemical signal can be more complicated and more specific and more different things, right? It's like, instead of just plugging into the wall and it's a cord to a cord, it's like you're mixing the drink and you can put different ingredients in and then pass that on, and then it gets picked up, and then that's why it like drops out serotonin and then it picks it up, and then some drugs are called reuptake inhibitors, which inhibit how much it reuptakes, and its uptake means take it back when it doesn't get taken by the other one. But all this kind of complicated stuff just is getting at this idea that some of the way that your brain sends messages, because what does even send messages mean, right? It's not like your brain's emailing itself, obviously. It's not like it's like text based. It's electrical and chemical. Yeah, and I appreciate that too. And I know that no one's really been messaging me or anything, but like, which is kind of surprising and kind of nice, and kind of it's kind of a testament to, sorry, my stomach's making weird noises, testament to all of you as students. It's like kind of nice. What I was going to say is that I think I can make better content for you and create a better learning experience for you this year if I don't feel pressured to, like, if I don't have it done by midnight Friday, everybody's upset. You know what I mean? And you haven't been like that. What? It's almost like there's, I think some of you will understand what like it's like being a bit anxious. It's like there's a part of my brain that like is constantly worried that that's what everyone's thinking, and part of it is because I don't get to actually see you, right? So I just like, you sort of live in my mind as students. That's until, actually, that's one of the reasons why there's sort of an interesting thing that happens once I start seeing people's projects and stuff, and I can picture you more as a class. It's calming as a teacher. Basically what I was saying is, if you do that to me, right, it's like, well, it's not one-sided. I think the way that I pay that back is I try to be very reasonable with, like, you know, if you have some kind of family thing, or if you have some kind of tech issue, especially around some assignment or something, like, don't stay up all night in anxiety about it. Like, message me and we'll figure something out and go get some sleep, and we'll just be normal humans about stuff. Okay, so anyways, synaptic density sounds, so density just means like, if I have 100 tennis balls and they're spread all out in that room, and then I have 100 tennis balls here, and they're all in a big pile. The density of tennis balls right here is higher because they're like all. That's a terrible example, but so synaptic density just means like how dense is the amount of connections in the brain. Okay, so here, let me get this. So in the last presentation, I talked about myelination and basically that idea of it being this like protective coating that develops on the outsides of the shells, and that begins prenatally. It continues into adolescence, and sometimes even where you've heard this before is when you hear people say, "Oh, a teenager's brain's not fully developed until they're like 21 or 22 or 23." Now they say, and it's like, well, what does that really mean? Because like their prefrontal cortex is there, and you don't want to make yourself sound silly because the brain is there. Like, what do you mean by that comment? I'm waiting. Oh, did Mike forget that this is a recording? No, but that was just a failed joke. Crickets. If I had the sound effects machine, it's like cricket, cricket, cricket. Myelination isn't finished. So in the late adolescent, early adult brain, the hardware's there basically. The wiring just isn't fully finished. It's like, this is actually a perfect example. So if you look at this is just, see how this looks like a thick cord, but then if I pull like this, you can see there's like two cords inside the bigger cord, and it's like, it's the bigger, oh, I hope I didn't mess up the recording. Okay, I don't think I did, even though it's getting all jumpy. Anyways, I was going to use that as the example of myelination. I might have to finish this point on the next slide. All right, that's weird because I just rewatched that and it didn't really look too glitchy, but it did to me. Okay, so the point I was going to make there was that just once I have, now that I have my computer sort of set up, I like bought some, this makes me sound nerdy, but some cord management stuff. So like some like basically just stuff to make it look a bit slicker. So it's like, that's almost just like a wrap thing that multiple cords get wrapped up in one cord, but it's like, well, what's that really do? Well, it just like, I don't know, makes things look a bit nicer, work a bit smoother, stay out of the way of other things. It's like, in a certain way, myelination is it's like the maintenance of the roads of your brain. If that construction metaphor works for you, it's like, and when that starts to break down, actually it's associated with all kinds of stuff we'll talk about later in the course, like especially things like MS. And it's like, well, because you don't actually want those wires touching in ways that you don't want. And I know your brain's not literally wires, but it's a useful metaphor. Right, so it's basically like, okay, what are the two big things that change in the first year of life? Well, one is myelination increases big time. And then the other one is these brain cells are now getting way more connected. So it's not just like this brain cell is connected to this one, and this one's connected to this one, and then this one's to this one. It's like they're all like, it's called a connectome, which just means like the wiring diagram of your brain. Like if you were to take each part, I think I have that word on one of the slides coming up, but if you were to take each connection, right, like this brain cell is connected to this, and then each of those ones it's connected to are also connected to a whole tree of ones, and then each of those ones are also connected, and there's all kinds of cross connections, and there's, you could almost draw like this super intense connectome is the word. It's just it's like genome and neural connections slammed into one word, connectome. Okay. And I think like one of the things I hope I can do for you is, I know education's going in such weird directions these days, like hopefully one thing I'm a bit of an older school teacher in a way. It's like, I think you need to know this stuff. It's like, it doesn't, if you're working with young people, For example, like the understanding of how what an infant's brain is, and that what an infant's brain basically does is it massively overproduces content so that it can then prune. And the fancy way to say this is there's an expansion of dendritic connections, which just means, like, if you remember a bit earlier in the other presentation, I was saying that basically you have a cell, and the cell has to, like, be able to send info but also take in info, and the way it takes info in is by these things that look almost like tree branches, and dendric is like, I think it's like Latin or Greek or one of those two for branch or tree or something like that. That doesn't really matter, except that just you can have that metaphor that it's basically the antennas. And that what's actually interesting about that, this is what I was going to say at the beginning. It's like, I think that it's like, well, why are you going to school? It's like, yeah, you're going to school to get a job. You're going to school for training. You're going to school to get this credit, whatever. It's like, yeah, but you're also learning to think complex thoughts and learning to think for yourself and learning how to articulate what you're thinking. And like, one of the ideas here is like, I don't need you to memorize this slide. I need you to get the point that this is pretty wild, that what the brain does is it doesn't build up. It builds. It's not like the baby between 0 and 1 is built. It's more like chipping away at a statue. There's so much, nearly twice as many connections are made than the baby will ever use. The brain's just like boom, boom, boom. It's like if you're trying to help me plug in my computer and you're just plugging it into everything, and some of the connections are right and some of the connections are wrong, and some of them I'm going to get rid of, and some of them are awesome, and those are going to be the most important ones ever. And that's how the brain builds. There's a beautiful design chaos to it almost. Used connections become strong and survive. Unused ones become replaced. Again, there's a lure of studying things like psychology to be able to think, oh, I know what the visual cortex is called. I know what the auditory cortex is. I know what the prefrontal cortex is. I can say the word dendritic or dendritic. You know, it's a weird word. It's like, but what does it mean? It means that like cells need to be able to receive information. That's a concept. Again, I'm trying to, like, if at the risk of overkill hardcore, I'm trying to explain the difference between concept and label, and that labels are basically just tools to get to the concept. Because, yeah, everyone, labels are just. I said it's a label at the end of that slide. It was a decent quote, but labels are just tools to get to the concepts. And now let's learn some labels. Okay, so the 4, right? And something that's in front of 4 is before that, before even that. It's like the forefront, the front. It's like, I'm just trying to make this point that all forebrain means is like, it's like the kind of, the forebrain refers to basically, okay, so sorry, I should be looking at the graphic that you're looking at instead of just freestyling about how there's basically again, it depends on, there's different ways to talk about what the brain is, because you can talk about it in terms of parts. You can talk about it in terms of what things do, which is more when you hear people talk about like lobes, right? Because you have lobes on both sides. I'm gonna get on that, I guess, on the next slide. I can just see here. And then some people talk of it almost more in this developmental evolutionary way of like, well, there's the hindbrain. There's like parts of the brain that we share with like basically all forms of more advanced life, right? Like the fact that we have similar stress responses, let's say, to like basically all mammals. So there's like the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain. You don't necessarily need to know this, but that the forebrain, I would just have the blue words. The forebrain includes the cerebral cortex, right? And the things beneath it. So if you look at this picture of the brain and you look at it as like this wrinkly stuff at the top, this is what we call the cerebral cortex. And it's actually super interesting if you just think about this for a sec, because like that cerebral cortex, an elephant's brain's bigger than your brain, but you're smarter than an elephant. An elephant actually has more brain cells than you, but why are you smarter than an elephant? Because you have more high-end cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, you couldn't, again, everybody's annoyed with how much I want to talk about AI, about everything, but like if you're making a connection to computers, your cerebral cortex is like your super brain, and then obviously like your prefrontal cortex, like the part of the cortex sort of means like processing unit, again to use computer language, but like and then the front part of that, the prefrontal cortex, the part that's right here, the part that if you were in a bad accident and got hurt, people would say that your personality changed. So then if you think of that wrinkled part as the cortex, and you think the forebrain is basically like that and what's below it. And you think that that's like what you're looking at, you're like, yeah, it's just a brain. It's like, no. Slow down. That's the most advanced organ in the universe that we know of right now. And if you think that that's a boring picture to look at, you gotta think how wild that is. That's my brain deciding to figure out a way to show your brain what a picture of a brain is, and your brain saying that it's not impressed. And even if you're not impressed, that exchange is wild. So then you have two halves of a sphere, two hemispheres, right? And then here's another interesting thing: is like the waviness, or the what you could say like kind of wrinkliness of the brain because if the brain was smooth, there'd be way less surface area, and you realize that wrinkle is actually an ingenious design, because you have to remember the brain's not sitting just in the skull. It's got the cerebral spinal fluid. It's like sitting in cerebral spinal fluid. It's sitting in a fluid. This fluid that's like, even that, it's just cerebral spinal fluid. It's just this like thing that sits in between this fluid that sits in between your brain and your skull, and this also just happens to be this fluid that washes through your brain when you dream and seems to clean your mind. And when you don't get enough of it, you feel groggy, and when you get enough of it, you feel restored. I'm just kind of in a weird mood, but I'm just kind of trying to hammer this point of like, be careful like getting too jaded. It's something I've dealt with too, is like the world, there's so much like lying, and there's so much like worry about this, worry about this, worry about this. This is how you're a good person. This is how you're a good person. It's like, and then a lot of those people aren't around in a year, and then a lot of those people aren't going to cross the street to help you anyways. And it's like, at a certain point, life can feel overwhelming, and it can feel lonely, and it can feel isolating, and it can feel like, and that's why I think that sometimes like getting fascinated about stuff is almost like a remedy. It's almost like it's showing, it's in a weird way, it's like almost a resistance. It's like a way of saying that you're not playing the dumb game anymore. It's like you should I work with a lot of students in Kitchener where it's like they're in a very different place than a lot of you, where it's like, and I'm not saying you have it easy at all. It's just incredible difficulties trying to be a student nowadays. I just mean that a lot of my students, like, because it's a 1-year sort of academic upgrading program, they might not have ever thought they were going to do college. And so part of one of my big things I always talk about is this idea of like how you view learning really matters. Like, the more you let your mind get fascinated, the more it pulls you forward. And you all know that, like when you're learning something that you find interesting, it's time flies. And when you're forcing yourself through a book that you can't stand, it's like pulling teeth, right? And how's that for a weird, random, not really related to the slide, but sort of related rant? All right, let's talk about the lobes of the brain. That's an interesting next topic. So you'll see in the, I won't read it all because it just makes for a super long, awkward slide. Now, some of you, I don't know how you're taking notes necessarily, and if you're just kind of watching the video and taking notes, that's probably the best way in a way, but, or if you wanted to download, I'll put the PowerPoints up too, if you wanted to like download the PowerPoint and then like print it in notes mode or something, or just take the notes in your PowerPoint as I'm talking or stuff, you'll find that these notes are already in it. And there's no real need for me to take it out. I'm not trying to trick anyone, and these notes aren't really like they're like literally presentation notes. They're not really my notes. They're just like things that um to be honest, they're often things that I sometimes say and sometimes I don't. And they're usually just like additional points about it. But for this slide specifically, you'll notice that I went a bit like intense in the note, just adding a bunch of stuff about like the different lobes. You know, again, I'm just, the reason I'm doing this long talk here is just to make the point that um, if you're taking notes, just handwritten, don't like scramble to go get the thing. You don't need to. I'll tell you what I really want you to sort of get about each area. Is that first of all, where's that point? Not there. There. That you have on both sides you have all four. Okay, so there's a frontal and occipital, temporal, and a parietal lobe on both sides of your brain um, that do sort of similar things and that look sort of similar, but not identical. And that's a little bit weird. Okay, so again, this is just something to know. It's that they're not. It's not quite as simple as it's just like you have. It's not like 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. It's sort of like that, but it's just as long as you keep in mind that that's sort of an oversimplification. It's not actually identical. But you basically have these four lobes, right? You have the, and just for your notes, you have it just generally like the frontal lobe is like your, basically your super processor. It's where a lot of your high-end decisions are made. Your temporal lobe is like controlling a lot of your rhythms and a lot of your be a good thing to say about temporal. No, I just said I wasn't gonna look at my notes, and then man, life's so annoying. It's like as soon as I do that, then I just like lose my thought. Um, the parietal lobe, I'll do that last because that's super interesting. The occipital lobe, yeah. So it's, oh yeah, this is interesting. Okay, so the occipital lobe's largely related to visual, but visual is like so complex because like I was saying this to my kitchen students the other day that like you burn a third of all of your calories in your brain, and something like half to a third of those calories are visual processing. So you burn a lot of your calories in processing visuals. But then it's like, well, it's that doesn't just mean you looking around processing. It also means you dreaming. It also means you thinking ideas with image-based content. It also involves you just like, even just you like listening to me looking at the screen and then looking at your phone and then doing this and then doing this. You're never like looking less intensely, really. It's like your whole, no, this is a good point. I said this to the class. I'm kind of freestyling. That's why I'm like, there's like little pauses. I'm trying to like go by the principle of, if you forget what you said, just wait a sec, don't panic, and it usually comes right back. But I was making the point to my class the other day that like, um, and then I do that, and then I just totally blank. Oh yeah, about how just with the visual center, man, visuals. So because you start to realize, and you know, I've been playing around so much with AI and how hard visual stuff is, and that when you're looking at me, not you, but I said this to the class, like, you're seeing me, your optic nerves are taking in the information of me upside down and then like flipping it over and then like making that make sense, and then you're like blinking for 2 hours of every day, but unless you're paying attention to it, you don't even notice that you blink. And so what's that? That's actually visual process. That's like your brain's GPU. It's your brain's graphic processing unit that's like makes you think that you're just living a constant movie. So now think of that for a sec. Because when you think of like how do you use so much energy with your brain, you think of how like, well, does like thinking of this use energy? And it's like sort of, but it's more the, and this is what took me, 3 minutes to articulate this point. It's more the playing the constant movie of your life in your head to you personally in a way that seems like everything's just stable. To do that requires intense graphic processing. We would call that in humans occipital lobe work. And then you have the temporal lobe, this, I didn't even say this, providing a lot of input into what those visuals mean. And the parietal lobe's trying to make a sense of a lot of this stuff too. So the temporal, and then the frontal lobe's doing a lot of the decision making, and the parietal and the temporal lobes are doing a lot of work in like trying to make sense of what's going on, right? And so I said that about the, I just want to get another point to tell you about the, yeah, so like the parietal lobes, okay, so I can say this a little bit better, and it's like, I'm like, maybe if you're the teacher, check your note before you read the slide, but I think some of it is like, again, the whole point I'm trying to say is your university students that are very smart, you can read the PowerPoint yourself if you want. I think what I'm trying to do is say things in a slightly different way, so maybe it like sticks memory-wise, right? These are all like Latin terms. They're going to be hard for anyone that's like just reading them out, right? But it's like, that's fine. Worry about the concept. The concept is what matters. The concept's all that matters. Okay. Okay, so this idea, this is like, it's like this presentation. It's fun doing, and I really like all of you students, but I am like hitting every red light in this presentation. It's like, don't worry about terms. Now here's a specific term. Lateralization is actually a good one, because well, if I get you to run a lateral in football, I mean like basically go straight. So the lateralization is basically saying like cut in half, that there's like a left side and a right side, and that this starts even before, like the easiest way of saying this is something that like, okay, well, when you expose a newborn to music, we see more electrical activity in the one side than the other, right? So it's like we can give a million examples, this, to get back to this concept versus label thing. It's like we can give a million examples, but the concept is the two sides of the brain don't do the exact same thing. And sometimes there's actually some wild examples of like kids that have had brain injuries really, really early in life and had parts removed, and the other side can pick up functions from the other side. Like the left side can start doing things that traditionally only the right side does, but that's if it's like the first year or so of life. Like once they, you can probably find it. There's some BBC documentary about a girl named Phoebe that I'll always remember, and it was like called The Girl Born with Half a Brain. And it wasn't that she had half a brain, it was that the corpus callosum, like the part that goes between the brain, for some reason there was a problem, and it was getting pinched, and so she basically, like, it starved the one side of her brain, so she had it totally atrophied and totally kind of quote unquote died. And she was young enough, she was only like a few months old, that they decided that the best move was to actually like remove it completely, and then they basically replaced it with like a shell to sort of hold the shape, and then not a shell but like a prosthetic skull. That would be exactly what it was. And then the kid's like basically a normal kid. But again, that sort of speaks to the magic of the developing brain, right? And when the brain still has undifferentiated cells in it, basically stem cells in it, and it's like, it's just at a different, It has the ability to still make cells. It's like the boringest word that's the most interesting. Specialized, right? Cells go from, and I did this early in the presentation, but it's mind-blowing, from just being a cell to being a cell that does something specific. And we like, oh, that's just called differentiation. They just start doing different things, and it's like, yeah, that's. If you tried to explain that to me 100 years ago, I'd think you're wild. Like, I wouldn't believe that that's a true thing. That's so intensely advanced. Right? We know, I think I already said this, greater electrical activity in one side. And that makes sense, right? Why would you design a supercomputer? There's going to be a lot of functional advantage to having certain things on both sides and able to share load and stuff like that. But having a complete A-B duplicate would make zero sense. For the so now, if again with the note, so all I say is in the note is like there's real limits in some ways of how we explore the early experiences of an infant, because obviously there's, like I say over there, that like, okay, you're not going to really do things like PET scans, like a position emission topography, or like even MRIs, unless it's like super emergency for, like, I don't even know what the scenario would be, maybe some extreme brain cancer situation. It's basically just that those x-rays technologies are just, they're not nothing. Oh, they're forms of controlled radiation, right? So you'd want to be careful how you're um, exposing a child's brain to it. I don't know why I'm like dancing around my words. It's like the most obvious point ever. Okay, so anyways, when the before birth, the development of the brain's almost all genetic, right? So if you think about what that means, so it's like basically all of how the baby's brain's developing in the womb is coming from the activation or the expression of the genetic code within inside the fertilized egg. But things like mom's stress levels, what mom's eating, whether or not mom's consuming alcohol, which is particularly an issue because of not for the very specific reason of how ethanol passes through the placenta. Um, and then after birth, the like once the baby's been born, genetics still have a major effect on development, but now all of a sudden the baby's in this stimulus based environment, right? The sense organs turn on basically, right? And inside the womb, the baby could, I shouldn't say the sense organs turn on, that's the wrong way of saying it, because obviously the baby can start to hear and stuff, and start to even hear the outside world, and definitely hearing mom's heartbeat and mom's internal sounds, and then definitely like probably not just seeing like shadows, and definitely can feel stuff. Taste, I don't even know if a baby can, if in the womb, can taste. Like, what would that even mean? And then smell, I don't think it's in the liquid world, right? So those two don't really make sense, I don't think. It'd be interesting if people want to email me, because I might be just, since I'm kind of freestyling this, I might be like missing something obvious. But then when I say freestyling, I don't, like, obviously I've prepared for this presentation, right? But sometimes it's better to just kind of prepare heavily and then just present your stuff and be a bit more conversational or podcast-ish about it. Right? And so then I say there, like, how much the child's exposed to, like, sights and smells and touch, which are all sensory, and then also things like language and eye contact, which, language is also, being exposed to language is going to be mainly auditory, or unless somebody's being really expressive, and then visual, but both sensory, and then eye contact sensory too. But it's like the eye contact thing's huge, babies look at people's eyes and the sides of their mouth. They don't look at your shoulder. And that's interesting. That's developmentally significant. That's evolutionarily correct. So here's a kind of cool word, and I think the reason I'm like, and I'm kind of, I don't know, I love making videos for NIPSing students and or for you specifically, and it's like, I know that sounds weird because you're probably thinking like, oh, like that's a weird thing to say considering you don't really know us, and it's like, well, I guess, but like this is my like fourth time I think doing this course to NIPSing students, and I guess a lot of at this point in the term what I'm saying, like, all NIPSing students are awesome and stuff, I'm somewhat, I guess, talking about past experiences and even just my early experiences with your group. But like all the emails you've been sending and stuff are all polite and nice, and any concerns people have have all been for things that I don't know, were like things I needed to fix. Like it was, what am I trying to say, all reasonable. So anyways, I'm just going to lean into the type of teacher I am, and I'm going to try to stop like talking about it every single slide. What's neuroconstructivist mean? It means that, like, think of, you've all heard the word construction before, right? To build something, basically, to construct it. And then that's interesting that like what a construct is, and then how that's a little bit different than what a concept is, and then how the word construction. So like a concept is, see what I just did there? I backed myself into a crazy corner of like, now I have to explain what the root con means. Because yeah, control, construct. I think it means to initiate action. If you go back to like Latin, there's some kind of like, there's definitely a connection between all those words, but let's just sidestep that. Okay, so neuroconstructivist means specifically like construction, right? To like construct the neurons to build the brain. So a neuroconstructivist view, then, fancy word, just means a brain builder view. That there's certain biology and certain environment issues, nature, nurture, that interact to influence the brain's development, and that the development of the brain and the kid's cognitive development are linked. That's actually a super important point. Okay, so that second point is kind of more unique. That first point is basically just nature, nurture. That second point's more unique to what neuroconstructivist means, that like specifically the idea is that, well, part of one of the reasons why someone that's 6 answers like they're smarter than someone that's 3 is because they've learned more, and some of it's because their brain's stronger. So some of it's that their brain's literally built from when they were 3. And so some of cognitive development is actually brain development. And what you realize is like, well, one of the reasons 6-year-olds outperform 3-year-olds is just because their attention span's better. It's not necessarily that their IQ is higher if you were to control for age. That's an awkward thing to say because IQ only makes sense against your age, right? IQ is basically like how smart average people your age are divided by how smart you are times 100. So say if I scored 100 and an average 43-year-old scores 100, then you divide 100 by 100, you get 1, times it by 100 again, and my IQ score would be 100, which is exactly average 100. So that math was messed, but I think it actually worked. And then how that brain develops influences or constrains, right? So it can shape in good or bad ways, or it can really hold back a child's ability to develop their thinking, their all these like kind of higher end brain skills, technical cognitive skills, we could say. So this part's super interesting when you look at the role of sleep, right? And you realize that actually a baby sleeps about Like, think about this. I have here that an infant spends about half of their sleep time in REM sleep. They often begin their sleep cycle in REM sleep rather than non-REM sleep. So babies drop into dreaming quicker into falling after falling asleep. They spend more time dreaming than we do, because I think we spend something like 1 out of 5 minutes in dream sleep in REM, and they spend 1 out of 2. Right? So it's like, and they fall into it quicker and they stay in it longer. So you could actually, when you line up all these facts, you could make a pretty interesting point that it seems like everything's pointing towards this idea of dreaming and brain building being intricately connected, if not the same thing. Let's just go with intricately connected. So at the same time, throw this up, the development of certain motor skills. Again, it's like if I wanted to go down this AI rant, it's like this is like basically to make the robot move. It's like it's actually kind of complex. It's like it's one thing to get a brain that thinks, it's another thing to get a brain that can control a moving thing, right? And it's like, well, you start to see that this actually starts to take time, and it takes a while for the baby to develop, like, say for example, eye hand, and they don't really develop eye foot until like 2 years, right? And we don't really call it eye foot, but you heard me in the last presentation say that that's basically walking. But babies are born with certain behaviors that they don't need to learn. Right? If I clap right in front of you, it makes you maybe go like this. It's like no one taught you to do that. That blinking is a natural reflex that you never lose. It's actually, I think, one of the only ones that you never lose. And so think about that for a sec, because that's interesting. So what a reflex is it's a behavior that you didn't learn. And that's a kind of wild concept. It's something that you know how to do but didn't learn. So for example, the baby, if you touch like this and the baby turns towards that to feed, and that's called the rooting reflex. And if you think about it in an animal that's not a human, so think about, like, say out in the wild, say like a cat has a bunch of kittens, and it's like the ones that don't learn how to latch probably don't make it. And so it's so evolutionarily important that the baby somehow is hardwired that behavior into their genetics. Like, it's like so complicated. Like what a reflex actually means. What does it actually mean? Because now we say reflexes means like just good eye-hand coordination, but actually the technical word reflex is a behavior that you know how to do without having learned it. So I have written in this note here, reflexes allow infants to respond adaptively to their environment before having any opportunity to learn. Again, like, what a super feature. So you don't need to like write these down or anything. I just wanted to sort of show you, this is from the book, and it's a pretty interesting chart. It sort of says like, okay, well, on the one side here we have the different reflex, and then we have what makes them do it, and then we have, or no, what the stimulation or what the cause is, preceding event, and then the response, and then how long it lasts, basically. So like if you look at blinking, it's like, okay, so blinking is caused by a flash of light or a puff of air in the face, and the response of the baby is to close the eyes, and then that basically happens forever. Whereas something like the rooting, if we go down the list a bit, when the cheek stroked or touched and the head turns towards, goes away at about 3 months. Right, so that's fascinating. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter if you're 60 years old and something there's like an explosive thing right in front of your face, automatically pulling back and blinking. And think of what blinking really is. Blinking is a last second move to protect your eyes. It's not a fear response. It's a biophysical eyeball protection mechanism. And you would do it to your other organs if you could. It's like, don't you ever wish, if you have like little kids complaining about something, be like, imagine if you could just, like, as easy as it is to go like from eyes open to eyes closed, if you could just close your ears, or if you're around something smelly, you could just like close your nose. Anyways, that's my weird comment of the day. So I sort of like these ideas. I'm going to end on this slide then. This is getting almost an hour. And then or it's like 50 minutes. Then I'll come back tomorrow. I think I'm going to try to do that more. Instead of trying to make like one epic video a week, once I get kind of caught up, maybe I'll still release them together so it's a little bit cleaner. Because I also don't want you to feel like I'm just constantly hitting you with content. Right, so it's this idea that like the developments, this is complicated but cool, that the reason, let's say take something like the baby learning how to walk, that happens, there's certain genetics happening, right? There's a reason why most kids aren't doing it at 2 months, and why most kids aren't doing it at 5 years, and why most are doing sort of around 2. And some of that there's something in the coding, to use that term. And if you don't think you're coding, it's like, well, okay, look at any book about genetics and see how long you have to get into the first page until they use the word code. But this idea that perception and action are coupled is actually really complicated, because it's saying that the baby wanting the toy and the baby learning to go and get the toy go together. Those aren't separate things. That what the baby wants and what the baby learns to do, it's like part of a lot of our skills, our responses to pressures we felt in our environment to do certain things. The baby wants to learn how to take a drink, so it needs to learn how to grab a cup, and it needs to be able to learn how to not hold the cup so much that it breaks it, and also not hold the cup so loose that it drops it, and also make sure that that all of these things go together, that actually infants perceive something that motivates them to act, and then they use their perception to fine-tune their movements, and that's actually how they learn stuff. Get more like eye hand or whatever. Right, and so this comes from, just to read the note because it's just sticking up, I bolded the one word, but it's like Arnold Giselle, who's kind of famous. So he's in like I have their 1934. And so that's like 90 years ago now, and he's starting to talk about genetics, and he's saying that it's like, well, it seems like the kids are like unfolding in a certain way, but that doesn't mean that like if you just took a kid and put them in a box in some made up scenario that they would unfold perfectly. They still need to be in environments that have certain opportunities for them to explore and to express the potential that's within them in this dynamic system theory. Meaning, basically, whenever you hear the word system, that just means that system and dynamic sort of mean the same thing. It's like a bunch of things interacting together at the same time. So it's what they're motivated for, how they move, how they're thinking about things, what their emotions are, that they are getting praised when they do it, it's not just simply that their walking speed's getting better. It's coupled with all these other things. That's why I kind of like that word, coupled. It's paired with all those other things. It's dynamically, systemly connected. It's like it's super good It's super really good, strong connected. It's like if you can laugh a little bit about the language and realize that a lot of it's like people are trying to like have their like coined term, and it's like, well, I'm more interested in like what are you trying to say, right? And how do we integrate that into our understanding of the complexities of human thought, which is an endless sea of fascination, right? It's like that's why I'm so interested in AI, because AI is human, right? AI is just like it's almost like humans looking back at themselves. Yeah, it's wild. Anyways, I'll end on that point, and then I'll do part 3 tomorrow, okay? And, if you're watching to this point, I just want to say thanks again for your patience, and more coming really soon. All right, cheers. Sending you love from Kitchener.